In the heart of southern Africa, on a sprawling plateau in modern-day Zimbabwe, stands a city of stone. It's a place of silent, breathtaking scale. Undulating walls of granite curve and rise, forming enclosures and passages that have mystified the world for centuries. As the largest ancient structure south of the Sahara Desert, it's a masterpiece of engineering. A city built with over 1 million individually shaped granite blocks. These walls, some reaching 36 feet into the sky, were constructed with such precision that for nearly 1,000 years they've stood without a single drop of mortar to hold them together. This is Great Zimbabwe. The name itself, in the language of the Shona people, means Great Houses of Stone. It was the capital of a vast and powerful kingdom, a hub of immense wealth and international trade that flourished for centuries while Europe was still deep in its Middle Ages. When the first whispers of its existence reached the outside world, it sounded like a fable, a lost city of gold, a remnant of a legendary past. But when European explorers, hunters, and prospectors finally saw it in the late 19th century, they were confronted with a sight their worldview just couldn't process. They saw a level of architectural sophistication they believed was simply impossible. Impossible, that is, for the ancestors of the African people who lived right there. Their refusal to accept the truth sparked one of the most bizarre and sustained campaigns of historical denial in modern history. It was a hunt, not for the truth, but for a phantom builder, anyone but the people right in front of them. This hunt gave rise to a parade of fantastical theories, each more elaborate than the last. They looked for a lost white race, for biblical kings and queens, and when all else failed, some even looked to the stars. These walls have stood for nearly 1,000 years. They're 36 feet high, built with 1 million granite blocks, and engineered so perfectly they needed no mortar. When the first European explorers saw them, they refused to believe who built them. So they invented elaborate fantasies, a lost biblical kingdom, the mines of King Solomon, and yes, even ancient aliens. But the truth is far more impressive than any fiction. This is the story of how a great African civilization was nearly erased by a bizarre racist hunt for its true creators. To really get the madness that followed, you first have to appreciate the marvel that caused it. Picture yourself walking through the Zimbabwean highveld. The air is warm, the landscape a rolling expanse of savanna and granite hills known as koppages. And then, rising from this ancient earth, you see it. It's not just a single building, but a sprawling complex whose ruins cover nearly 200 acres, part of a larger monument area of almost 1,800 acres. There's the hill complex, the oldest part of the city, perched atop a steep-sided granite hill. Its walls seem to grow organically from the boulders, weaving the natural landscape into its very design. This was the spiritual and political heart of the city, a residence for kings and a place of sacred ritual, with major stone construction starting in the 11th century. From here, the rulers could look down upon their capital. Below lies the Valley of Ruins, where most of the city's estimated 18,000 inhabitants once lived. This was the bustling urban center, a place of homes and workshops. And then there is the most iconic structure of all, the Great Enclosure. This is the largest single ancient structure in all of sub-Saharan Africa. Its massive outer wall is over 820 feet long, and up to 36 feet high, a massive elliptical curtain of stone. The sheer scale is hard to wrap your head around. It's estimated that 1 million granite blocks were quarried, shaped, and moved to build this enclosure alone. What truly stuns engineers today is the construction method, a technique known as dry stone masonry. The builders used granite from the surrounding hills, which naturally splits into slabs. They would heat large granite outcrops with fire, then douse them with cold water, causing the rock to fracture along clean lines. Then, with painstaking effort, they shaped each block, fitting them together so perfectly that gravity and friction alone have held them in place for centuries. The tops of many walls are decorated with intricate patterns, chevron, herringbone, and checkerboard designs laid right into the stone, showing off not just their engineering skill, but their artistry. Inside the great enclosure, the purpose of the structures is still debated. Passages wind between thick walls, leading to smaller enclosures, and at its heart stands another mystery, the conical tower. It's a solid, cone-shaped structure, 30 feet high, built with the same impossible precision as the walls around it. Nobody knows its exact purpose. There are no rooms inside, no stairs to the top. Some scholars think it was a symbolic granary, representing the king's power and his duty to provide for his people. Others suggest a religious or astronomical function. It remains silent, guarding its secrets. This was a city humming with life. It was the capital of a kingdom whose wealth was built on cattle, farming, and most importantly, gold. The kingdom controlled trade routes from the gold fields of the interior to the Swahili coast, where merchants from Arabia, Persia, and even China came to trade. Archaeologists have unearthed Chinese porcelain, Persian glass beads, and Arab coins, proof of a global trade network. This wasn't some isolated outpost, it was a cosmopolitan center of power in the medieval world. Around the year 1400, for reasons still debated, maybe a decline in trade, political shifts, or climate change that wore out the land, the city was slowly abandoned. The seat of power moved on, and the great stone houses fell silent. But they didn't disappear. They stood, waiting. And in the 19th century, they were discovered by a world completely unprepared for the truth they held. The story of the denial of Great Zimbabwe starts with a mix of arrogance, greed, and a deep, unshakable belief in racial superiority. As early as 1531, a Portuguese captain named Vicente Pagado recorded local tales about the impressive stone fortress. But it was in the late 19th century, during the Scramble for Africa, that the real myth-making began. The first major character in this drama is Karl Mauch, a German geologist and explorer. Mauch was a man of his time, searching for fame, fortune, and the biblical land of Ophir, the legendary source of King Solomon's gold. In 1871, guided by a local hunter named Adam Renders, Mauch arrived at Great Zimbabwe. He was awestruck, but his awe was immediately filtered through thick prejudice. In his diary, Mauch wrote that he couldn't believe the local people could have built such structures. He saw the local Shona people as savages, incapable of such grand designs. Instead, his mind leaped to the only explanation he could imagine. He found a wooden beam and, deciding it was cedar, made a wild assumption. The wood, he declared, must have come from Lebanon. And who brought cedar from Lebanon to build great things? King Solomon. Therefore, Mauch announced, the hill complex must be a copy of Solomon's temple, and the great enclosure a replica of the palace of the Queen of Sheba. There was zero evidence for this. His wood identification was wrong, and his logic was even worse. The very artifacts he sketched in his notebooks, iron gongs, pottery, local carvings, were clearly African. But Mauch's mind was made up. He wrote that only a civilized nation must once have lived there, with the racist implication being crystal clear. Mauch's theory was exactly what the colonial world wanted to hear. It spread like wildfire. The idea that a lost white civilization had once colonized this part of Africa served a powerful political purpose. If this land was once ruled by outsiders, it offered a historical excuse for European colonization. It was a way of saying, we're just reclaiming what was once ours. This story was eagerly picked up by Cecil Rhodes, the British mining magnate carving out a personal empire in southern Africa. In 1890, he financed an expedition led by James Theodore Bent with one clear instruction: prove that Great Zimbabwe wasn't built by Africans. Bent, a travel writer, dutifully concluded the builders were from the Arabian Peninsula, probably Phoenicians. But the most destructive person in the site's history was Richard Hall. Appointed as curator in 1902, Hall was a journalist, not an archaeologist, and a firm believer in the foreign origin theory. He saw his job not as preservation, but as purification. In his own words, he was there to remove the filth and decadence of the Kaffir occupation. Under the guise of archaeology, Hall started a campaign of systematic destruction. He believed the real non-African civilization was in the deepest layers, and everything on top was the degraded work of local people. So he destroyed it. He recklessly removed up to 12 feet of archaeological deposits from the enclosures, layers containing the entire history of the site, the pottery, the tools, the clues that tell archaeologists who lived there and when, were shoveled out and thrown away. He was literally destroying the evidence that contradicted his own theories. After wiping the slate clean, he triumphantly declared the city was built by ancient Phoenicians. The damage Hall did was catastrophic and irreversible. He didn't just misinterpret history, he gouged it out of the earth. These theories became official doctrine. In the colony Rhodes named after himself, Rhodesia, the state-sanctioned story was that Great Zimbabwe was a mystery, probably built by foreigners. Guidebooks showed images of Africans bowing to the supposed foreign builders. The denial of African heritage wasn't just some fringe theory anymore. It was a tool of state policy to legitimize minority rule. The absurdity peaked with even wilder ideas. It was the work of the Chinese, Persians, or when no earthly explanation fit their prejudice, they looked to the sky, whispering that only ancient aliens could have built something so perfect. This idea, while not mainstream, was the ultimate expression of the refusal to accept African ingenuity.
While politicians and fantasists were inventing phantom builders, the rigorous science of archaeology was starting to take hold, and it was science that would eventually tear down the whole house of cards. The first real blow to the colonial narrative came in 1905, just 3 years after Richard Hall began his rampage. The British Association for the Advancement of Science, concerned by the biased work, sent a trained archaeologist, David Randall McIver. Unlike his predecessors, Randall McIver wasn't looking to prove a pet theory. He was a professional, and he came to do one thing: examine the evidence. He excavated several areas, carefully documenting the layers of occupation, a practice Hall had ignored. What he found was conclusive. The artifacts he unearthed deep within the oldest parts of the site, the pottery, tools, and household items, were undeniably of local origin. He compared them to the culture of the modern Shona people in the region and found a clear, unbroken line of cultural connection. He also found imported goods, like beads and porcelain, but they were in the upper, more recent layers, not the bottom ones. This was crucial. It showed the city was already thriving before these foreign goods arrived, not founded by the people who brought them. In his 1906 book, Medieval Rhodesia, Randall McIver stated his conclusion bluntly. The ruins were unquestionably African in every detail. He dated them to the medieval period, not ancient times. He had solved the mystery. But the colony of Rhodesia wasn't ready for the truth. His findings were met with outrage and dismissed by the government. They attacked him professionally and clung to their myths. The lie was more comfortable. For over 2 decades, the battle raged. In 1929, the British Association decided to settle it once and for all. They sponsored a second, even more exhaustive investigation led by one of the most formidable archaeologists of her generation, Gertrude Caton Thompson. Caton Thompson was a trailblazer in a field dominated by men. Known for her meticulous work and no-nonsense approach, she had no patience for the romantic fantasies surrounding Great Zimbabwe. She even kept a file for all the crackpot theories sent to her, which she simply labeled insane. She understood that to prove who the builders were, she had to dig outside the main ruins, in areas untouched by treasure hunters like Hall. Her most brilliant move was digging a trench near the great enclosure, revealing the undisturbed layers of history. This technique, stratigraphy, is based on a simple idea. The deepest layers are the oldest. At the very bottom, on bedrock, she found pole and daga huts, classic indigenous African structures, along with simple, locally made pottery. As she moved up through the layers, the pottery grew more sophisticated and the building techniques evolved, culminating in the magnificent stone walls at the top. The evidence was irrefutable. She had found the origin story of Great Zimbabwe written in the earth itself, a continuous indigenous development from a small village to a great city. In 1931, Caton Thompson presented her findings. She declared that the ruins were the product of a native civilization, showing originality and amazing industry. She stated definitively that after examining all the evidence, there was not one single item that is not in accordance with the claim of Bantu origin and medieval date. The reaction was furious. Again, the settler government of Rhodesia rejected her conclusions. The myth of a foreign origin was too important to their political identity. They suppressed the truth for decades, but science had spoken. Gertrude Caton Thompson's work was so thorough it became the unshakable foundation for all future research. Later, in the 1950s, radiocarbon dating would confirm her medieval dating beyond any doubt. The hunt for phantom builders was over. The science was settled. It just took politics another 50 years to catch up. With the myths finally stripped away, the true story of Great Zimbabwe could be told. And it turned out the reality was far more magnificent than any colonial fantasy. This wasn't the work of foreign adventurers. It was the capital of a dynamic, wealthy, and sophisticated African empire built by the ancestors of today's Shona people. The civilization that built Great Zimbabwe emerged around the 11th century, building on traditions of earlier cultures. The people belonged to the Karanga group of the Shona, and they were masters of their environment. They were skilled cattle herders and farmers, but their real power came from controlling the region's most valuable resource, gold. The Zimbabwean plateau was rich in gold, and the kingdom organized its trade with incredible efficiency. At its peak, the kingdom was a major supplier of gold to the world's medieval economy. From Great Zimbabwe, a vast trade network was managed. Gold and ivory went east to port cities like Sofala, where they were traded with merchants from across the Indian Ocean. In return, the elite of Great Zimbabwe imported luxury goods from across the globe. Chinese celadon, Persian glass beads, and Arabian coins all speak to the kingdom's role as a major hub in the global economy. This immense wealth funded the city's construction and supported a highly layered society. The stone enclosures weren't just for defense, they were powerful statements of class and authority. The royal elite lived inside the stone walls, physically separate from the commoners. The king, or Mambo, was at the top, seen as both a political and spiritual leader with a connection to the ancestors and the supreme god Mwari. The society was also a hub of incredible craftsmanship. They were expert metalworkers, forging iron into tools and weapons, and gold into beautiful jewelry. But the most iconic artifacts are the 8 Zimbabwe birds, unique sculptures carved from soapstone. Each stylized bird, combining animal and human features, sat atop a stone monolith. These are thought to be powerful symbols, possibly representing royal spirits or messengers of the gods, like the bateleur eagle. They were symbols of a belief system and an artistic tradition that was purely African. The architectural skill, the global trade network, the complex society, and the unique art all point to a civilization at the height of its power between the 13th and 15th centuries. The idea that its people couldn't build their own capital wasn't just a mistake, it was a profound failure of imagination.
a blindness caused by prejudice. The truth was, the ancestors of the Shona people didn't need help from anyone. They built their great houses of stone themselves, creating a wonder of the medieval world.
The story of Great Zimbabwe is a powerful reminder that history is often a battlefield where truth has to be fought for. The deliberate erasure of African achievements is a pattern that is repeated across the continent. If you want to learn more about how other incredible African histories were buried and are now being reclaimed, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. And let us know in the comments, what other historical myths do you want to see us debunk? Your suggestions help shape our content, and together we can keep digging for the truth. By the mid-15th century, the great city was largely abandoned as political power and trade routes shifted north. But the walls remained. They stood as silent witnesses, waiting for their story to be told correctly. For decades, even after Gertrude Caton Thompson's definitive work, the colonial government of Rhodesia clung to the lie. It was a cornerstone of their ideology. To admit that a great African civilization had flourished there long before Europeans arrived was to undermine their entire claim to rule. The fight over the stones of Great Zimbabwe was a fight for the soul of the nation. But truth, even when buried, has a way of enduring. For the African nationalist movements fighting for independence, Great Zimbabwe became a powerful symbol of a glorious pre-colonial past and a direct refutation of the colonial narrative that Africa had no history. The stone birds became emblems of the liberation struggle. So it's no surprise that when white minority rule ended in 1980, the newly independent nation cast off the colonial name. They reached back into their own history, to that magnificent city of stone, and named their country Zimbabwe. The Zimbabwe bird was placed on the new national flag, a permanent declaration of the country's heritage. Today, Great Zimbabwe is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized as a monument of universal value. It is a source of immense national pride, a link to ancestors, and a sacred place still used for spiritual ceremonies. The story of Great Zimbabwe is more than just an archaeological puzzle. It's a parable about how prejudice can blind us and how science can help us see. The bizarre hunt for its true builders was never about evidence. It was about preserving a worldview where only certain people were seen as bearers of civilization. The ruins of Great Zimbabwe stand today as a triumphant refutation of that worldview. They aren't a monument to a lost tribe or visitors from another planet. They are a monument to the ancestors of the Shona people, to a mighty African kingdom, and to a history that refuses to be erased. The stones, in their silent, magnificent way, have finally had the last word.